Hello, my name is Julia Tittelbach. I am a policy researcher at Vocal Europe. It is a pleasure as well as an honor to be joined today by Ambassador Delcourt, Honorary Ambassador of Belgium and guest professor at the Université Catholique de Louvain, and member of the Académie Royale de Belgique et de l'Académie des Sciences d'Outre-mer. You have also been recently appointed as member of the advisory board to Vocal Europe. Throughout your career, you have distinguished yourself in various positions. You have been ambassador to Sweden, Poland, and Canada. And in your research, you focus on a variety of topics such as EU affairs, multilateral negotiations, and the evolution of Western diplomacy. Mr. Ambassador, I'm truly delighted that you agreed to this exchange here today despite your hectic agenda. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with the very first question. We had many high-ranking political meetings and summits recently, the G7, EU-US summit, NATO summit, and the Biden-Putin meeting. What has maybe taken you by surprise, both in a positive but also in a negative way?
On a positive way, I would say America is back. If you compare the NATO to an orchestra, we lacked a conductor for a while. Now the conductor is back and we are going to play harmoniously, I believe. So I have to underline the fact that the Americans have indeed, in spite of the Trump years, kept their capacity to galvanize the NATO partners. NATO has shown, and this is indeed very positive as well, a resilience which is important for the future of the organization. And we have with President Biden a president who is in a way more pro-European than former President Obama, and who is, has been able to convince the partners to kind of support the narrative of the Americans regarding the values they want to defend and the challenges which are ahead. The way the NATO summit and the G7 and others have been summarized is with the 4 C's, you know, the cyber, China, climate change, and indeed these were the main topics. COVID also is one of these 4 C's, and hopefully there also we have been able now to show that we are working together to kind of face this type of situation which affected the whole world. Now, we were maybe from the European side not expecting that the American would put so much emphasis on China. I'm not saying that this is negative, but I'm saying that we have perhaps, we Europeans, a different and slightly more nuanced approach about the relationship with China. But obviously, the Americans consider China as their main challenger for the years ahead, and they expect the Europeans to kind of support them in this view, and that's where discussion will have to take place. I would conclude by saying that the dynamic is there, the link, the transatlantic link is restored. Now we have to give content to the transatlantic partnership. And this is what expects us for the next few years.
So you just said that the US would be back. The same then also counts for NATO. So the past NATO was declared obsolete and brain dead. Now President Biden has reiterated the US commitment to the Article 5, and also Wolfgang Ischinger, he recently pointed out that indeed NATO would be back. So do you agree then with this assessment?
I do agree. But I would like to underline that the perception of NATO security is different. among partners. And for obvious reason, for geopolitical reason, our Eastern European friends consider NATO security as of adamant importance because of the threat they are perceiving from a power which is has become very much aggressive these last years. In Western Europe, we may have a different perception based more, if you like, on defense and dialogue. Would that create tension among NATO partners? I hope not. But, and I want to add to this that the Europeans do not perceive China as a threat the same way the Americans do. So here we have this, if you like, these different perceptions, which I believe, and this is new and interesting, the American take into consideration. There was a time that the American would not accept any divergent views. Luckily, President Biden has kind of restored this dialogue with partners, and we have to appreciate that.
So what are the major challenges then, internally but also externally, which the alliance is currently facing but also will face in the near future?
Well, as it will be mentioned later on, there are challenges like climate change, like space, like China, after all, and Russia, which are obvious. And for all those which I've just mentioned, I'm glad to see that with the visit of President Biden, it was decided to set up EU-US working groups to see how we are going to face those challenges together. Internally, I alluded already in my previous answer the fact that the perception of threat is different, whether you're a Western European country or an Eastern European one. And finally, and that will be also mentioned later on in the conversation, this perception that we have, I mean, at least if some European countries, that we need to develop our own defense autonomy and again, when we speak of strategic autonomy, we understand that our Polish friend may have a different view than, say, the Belgian or the French. But this again is another important challenge, I would say even priority, that we'll have to take into consideration.
So we'll come back to China in a second. First of all, I would like to ask a question about climate change, because the NATO statement described climate change indeed as a crisis multiplier and one of the defining challenges of our times. It also said that NATO wanted to be a leading international force in understanding and adapting to the ways climate change will impact the world. How would you describe then the nexus between climate change and security, and what is your take on the NATO's role in actually fighting climate change?
I'm very happy that NATO has made of climate change one of its priority. And I've read that Canada will host actually a kind of study center on climate and security to study more carefully the effect of global warming on security and defense. Now, this is something concrete. There are two, we don't have time to dwell too much into this question, which is fascinating, but basically there are two elements to take into account. One is that, which is obvious, you mentioned it yourself, the existential threat posed to national security, posed by climate change, with displacement of population, desertification, rising of sea level and all that. The Arctic, I had the chance when I was ambassador to Canada to go to the Arctic. The Arctic is warming up twice as fast as the global average. Those are very acute geostrategical issues. The second element of climate change that people maybe do not think at, it is the effect of climate change on the military equipment and military personnel. How the NATO will have to adapt to extreme climate situation or conditions. Our equipment is maybe not made to resist to this type of situation. And a third element actually is the fact that, well, the military equipment is actually using or producing a lot of greenhouse gases. Now, can we imagine tomorrow a tank working with solar panels? You know, all this is maybe a bit too much futuristic, but we have to look at that also.
So getting back to China now, it was the very first time that China was branded as a security threat. And yet dealing with Beijing constitutes still a balancing act between necessary cooperation and system rivalry. How can and will the alliance deal with China, taking into account diverging member states' interests?
Well, look, we have to be careful when using words like threat and all its existential threat, even when we speak about China. I think that really, I mean, this is my humble view, but I like to quote, I think it was President Macron saying that China is a partner, a competitor, and a rival at once. But very few in the EU are looking at China as a threat. China is a foreign policy issue. And we have to deal with this issue at different levels. I think President Biden himself realized that the answer to the so-called Chinese threat is not just military, of course. There is actually a decision which was made to set up a EU-US working group on China. And China is an indirect threat, indeed, in the sense that when we see that China is investing massively in European infrastructure, and that 10% of all the European ports are actually in the hands of the Chinese, then that some rails and roads infrastructure in Eastern Europe have been made by the Chinese, that the Chinese are also penetrating our cyber system. All this is, of course, complicating, if you like, the military mobility of NATO. And I would not speak about Huawei and the whole issue about the 5G, and do we want Huawei or do we use the Europeans and all that. So we have to be careful, but not paranoid, I believe. The Chinese market is very important to us and to the Americans. We have to indeed, in some respect, cooperate with the Chinese. They are with us in, for instance, the JCPOA negotiation with Iran. They somehow cooperate also with us when it comes to piracy. So we have to have a kind of clear dialogue with the Chinese. China is not Russia, or even less the Soviet Union. It's not a classical military threat to NATO, but we need to carefully look at how China affects our core interest. So I would conclude by saying, with China, you need awareness, you need political coordination, and by the way, you need to coordinate with a neighbor of China, like South Korea, Japan, and some others. And you finally need to screen and assess very well what the Chinese are doing on the European continent.
So the rules-based democratic order is perceived to be under threat due to a systemic challenge from autocratic regimes. And there's actually the idea of creating a format like the Democracies 10 that has been reiterated and supported by prominent politicians such as President Biden or also Chancellor Merkel. And they have all called for fostering strategic alignment and an enhanced coordinated action among a group of like-minded states. So what do you think, where's the added value of such a framework and what could also be the limits?
You know, I'm very careful with this type of proposal of creating a closer group of like-minded, because there are always countries which are frustrated not to be part of this like-minded group, and then India is considering itself as a democracy, and what do you do with India, for instance, in that case, or Japan? And now, what is at stake is indeed multilateralism, and Belgium, as a matter of fact, and some other countries, of course, are defending very firmly the multilateral path. But actually, if you look at bigger powers, China, India, US, Russia, for them the world is multipolar actually, and that's what counts. It's the, as we say in French, le rapport de force, where they can show their strength, and basically they think in the shape of a zero-sum game. Which is the opposite of multilateral diplomacy, if you like. So I understand the concern of those who are proposing this, but I'm not sure the solution they are offering is a very solid one.
Okay, looking at EU-NATO cooperation and also the big debate around European strategic autonomy that you have also already mentioned. The United States, Norway and Canada, they have joined PESCO's project on military mobility, which to some extent can testify for improving EU-NATO cooperation. And adding to that, we currently have discussions about the strategic compass and NATO 2030, which in itself also provides a window of opportunity now. So what is your assessment on the future of EU-NATO cooperation?
Well, I'm glad with President Biden that we are again in a situation where there is some consideration, if you like, given to the Europeans among the NATO partners. And you know, there was a time a few years back when a defense secretary in the US administration was opposing older Europe to new Europe. It was the time of Rumsfeld, as a matter of fact. This type of opposition, I think, is actually useless. And I do believe that President Biden do not demand to the NATO partners to be all aligned to the Americans. And as you mentioned, if we kind of incorporate the American and Canadians, for instance, into some of our military program, PESCO is one example, cooperation could be actually stronger. Now, to give a kind of a more broader answer to your question, I would say that time has come, I believe, to look at what the French call la solitude stratégique of the EU, which is basically that, to put it bluntly, that somehow we have to count on our own forces at one point or another. I mean, we do value the support of the Americans, and today we would not be able actually to defend the European continent without the support of the Americans. But on the other side, we have to realize that it is of vital importance to kind of foster strategic autonomy. Now, we do not have a European army, and it will not be the case before long. But when you see that the French are the only one were able to project their forces in the Sahel region and that the other partners are not joining them. Well, we have to look at that, and probably it's not just cooperating in terms of military program, but really developing our capacity as the EU to have, say, a battle group, for instance, which would work. I mean, the notion of battle group is a rather old one. We have not been able so far, it's amazing, to deploy 1,600 military people and their equipment abroad for a short military intervention. This is left to some countries like France to do it on their own. So look, it's a large debate, but I think that it has been a wake-up call, and that not just because once the French president said that something very negative about the NATO, but that was again to kind of make us move and realize that we should not rely eternally on NATO.
In 2019, space became the Alliance's fifth domain of operations, and now NATO leaders have expanded their mutual defense clause to include a collective response to attacks in space as well. Can you maybe elaborate why space has become a new priority now?
Well, it's interesting to see that countries which are not on the forefront of space technology, like Iran, for instance, are launching rockets and trying to have their share in, if you like, in the space technology. Space is the last frontier somehow. It has the advantage of being transparent. So if a country launch a rocket or launch a satellite, well, all the others will, of course, see it and take note of it. But space is important for the NATO for two reasons. One is that it helps to monitor what the others are doing, and it is thanks to GPS and all that, that we were able to monitor what was happening on eastern Ukraine, for instance. Secondly, space has a very narrow link, if you like, with new technologies and communication. You, of course, would not be able to use your GPS without a satellite, and the influx of information exchange in the world today would not be possible without the support of some space technology, so including military. So all this makes of space indeed a new important security challenge. Soon we will see, for instance, the Chinese launching a space shuttle, so they will really have mastered the space technology to a point which could be of some concern to us. So yes, it is important, and it is indeed important that NATO devote enough time on that.
Ambassador Delcourt, it was a pleasure as well as an honor to exchange with you today. Thank you so much for your time and for your expertise.